The late Honorable Paul T. Hellyer, former Defense Minister of Canada, is the highest ranking government official to ever come forward to state, without question, UFOs are real and aliens are here. He's the only cabinet official of the G7 nations to ever say this. He's also clear and transparent with us about how he came about this information. His principal knowledge wasn't acquired while he was a defense minister in Canada, even as several UFO cases did come across his desk, but he learned it from colleagues, military generals in the US, Canada, and elsewhere, after he left office. He conversed with others that have come forward, including late Apollo Astronaut Dr. Edgar Mitchell, and as a result has built a comprehensive picture that he shares in a lecture at the 27th Conference of the Society for Scientific Exploration in Boulder, Colorado in 2008. Paul Hellyer was first elected in 1949. He held senior posts in the governments of Prime Ministers Lester Pearson and Pierre Trudeau, who defeated him for the Liberal Party leadership in 1968. The following year, after achieving the rank of Defense Minister, he was later designated Deputy Prime Minister. After retiring from politics, Paul Hellyer became involved with extraterrestrial presence and technology. This lecture is an eye-opening look at a man of integrity whose contributions to the truth-seeking mission regarding unexplained phenomena are invaluable. Paul Hellyer passed away on August 8, 2021, being the longest-serving member of Queen Elizabeth's Privy Council for Canada. Let's listen to the late, great Honorable Paul T. Hellyer.
Well, as a result of the notoriety gained by the dubious distinction of being the first person of cabinet rank in the G8 group of countries to speak out and say that UFOs are real, no qualifications, they are as real as the airplanes flying over your head. I was able to meet some very interesting people that I certainly wouldn't have met otherwise. One was Edgar Mitchell, Apollo Astronaut. He was coming to Toronto to make a speech, so he let it be known that he would be interested in meeting me, and so my wife, who was with me here today, was gallant enough to say, let's invite him for dinner. So we did. And he came with his escort, and we had 3 marvelous hours discussing his career as an astronaut, his epiphany, and his deep, deep concern now for the future of our planet. I had the honor of sharing a platform with him at an X-conference in Washington in April of this year. And the introduction to his talk was quite intriguing. He asked us to take our minds back 100 years to the time when the Wright brothers were trying to get an airplane off the ground carrying a man. And then planes were developed larger and larger. We got to the Douglas DC-3, which was the queen of the skies and sort of the ultimate in air travel. And then faster and bigger planes, turboprops, jet planes, supersonic planes, and finally putting people on the moon. All in the space of less than 1 century. So have you ever thought ahead, because this is only the beginning, have you ever thought what it will be like 100 years from now? Or even 1,000 years from now? Assuming, of course, that in the meantime we don't make the planet uninhabitable, which is our current flight path. Reading Colonel Corso's book was a real eye-opener for me. I had, of course, received reports of UFO sightings when I was Minister of National Defense. Like most people in that position, about 80% of them were natural phenomena, and 15 or 20% were not, and just had written beside them unexplained. But Corso's book was an eye-opener, and when it was confirmed by a retired United States Air Force general of my acquaintance as being every word is true, quote unquote, and more, and then spending some time with him discussing both some of the basics and the and more, I decided that I had to say something about it. In government, I was just too busy. I was responsible, as some of you may know, for unifying the Royal Canadian Navy, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and the Canadian Army into a single armed force for Canada. And if you don't think that's a tough, tense job, I recommend you try and get the job as Secretary of Defense in Washington and try unifying the U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force, and I wish you luck. But by the time I got out of that job, I was, as Courtney said, neither convinced, I neither believed nor disbelieved. I just didn't know, and I was far too busy to worry about it, frankly. But then after I read Corso's book, and my general friend confirmed it, he confirmed a lot of things that are now widely known. And I'd like to read some of them. A UFO did crash at Roswell, New Mexico on or about July the 4th, 1947. There were humanoid creatures aboard when it crashed. Corso was not at the crash scene at the time and did not personally see the survivor that was carried into the Army Air Force infirmary that he writes about in his book. He did later, however, see one of the cadavers being transported, presumably for autopsy. The colonel's personal involvement really began more than a decade later, when he was posted to the Pentagon and his boss, the Lieutenant General Arthur Trudeau, gave him the Foreign Technology Desk and turned over the top secret Roswell files and a file of wreckage, a cabinet of wreckage which had been collected from the crash site in New Mexico. And Trudeau asked him to make a list of those areas where he thought something might be developed which would be of use to the United States Army. So he did. And the list as it developed included the following: image intensifiers, which ultimately became night vision. I had the privilege of attending one of the first demonstrations, although I didn't know at the time where the technology had come from. Fiber optics, which have revolutionized telecommunications worldwide. Supertenacity fibers, lasers, molecular alignment metallic alloys, integrated circuits, and micro-miniaturization of logic boards. When I read this one, I thought to myself, my gosh, I visited SAC headquarters some years ago, and I was taken into the computer room, and the computer filled the whole room from end to end. And today, thanks to this new technology, grace of our visiting friends, you could put more than that capacity in a box the size of that would fit into a picnic basket, or maybe even smaller. Then there was the HARP, the High Altitude Research Project, Project Horizon, which was the moon base, portable atomic generators, ion propulsion drive, irradiated food, third brain guidance systems, that's the headbands that the EBs worn to give instructions to their ships, because they didn't use the conventional controls. It was all done by mental telepathy. And then particle beams, Star Wars, anti-missile weapon systems, electromagnetic propulsion systems, and depleted uranium projectiles. Well, I hasten to point out that in some of these areas, research was already being done. But in many of the others, it was not, because the technology that the visitors left when their crash occurred was light years ahead of ours. It is also worth noting, as some of Corso's detractors point out, that he didn't know what the Navy and the Air Force were doing at the same time in the same areas. And as a former Minister of National Defense, I can attest that with separate services, often they don't tell the other services what's going on. They treat them more as an enemy than they do as a member of the team. I am, of course, fascinated by the technical advances that we have made. They are mind-boggling, almost beyond comprehension. But these developments alone would not have been enough to get me to speak out. I went public because I am even more fascinated, and may I say concerned, by the geopolitics and the exopolitics of the intervening decades. These are two profoundly important issues that are difficult to talk about and impossible to debate when the official position of the United States remains that UFOs do not exist. Just 2 weeks ago, I listened to a United States scientist on the radio in Toronto describing what sounded like a rather expensive project to try and locate planets elsewhere in the cosmos that would sustain life. And she gave the impression that they hadn't yet found any, but they were going to keep on looking. And I was tempted to phone the radio station and say, why doesn't she just go and ask some of the people that have talked to them and ask them where they came from? And this is the kind of waste that goes on when the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. But I digress. I can understand the near panic in the late 40s and early 50s, when all of a sudden the US Armed Forces found themselves in a most unusual position. They had just contributed magnificently to the winning of the war in Europe. They were top dogs. And all of a sudden they were confronted with a technology that was greater than their own, and they didn't know how to cope. And near panic set in. They knew that it was not of this world. And they decided to keep it a closely guarded secret on the basis that if the public was aware that there might be another panic, not unlike the one that Orson Welles created when he had his War of the Worlds as a Halloween hoax. I'm sure that an equal concern was that another earthly power, and I suppose we might just as well be specific and say the Soviet Union, might have the same kind of opportunity to develop the technology and might get ahead of the United States. And this could lead to a position where the United States would cease to be the predominant military power in the world. And this fear could have been nurtured by hints from Dr. Werner von Braun that the Germans might have had access to some of this technology as early as the 1930s. Well, this led the United States to embark on a reverse R&D program unprecedented in earthly history. Well, the secrecy made sense, in my opinion, until the end of the Cold War. But there is no legitimate reason why these clandestine operations should not have been made public when the Soviet Union collapsed. The United States had no other enemies with any military capability to speak of. There were no real threats. A good, fairly large peace dividend could have been declared. But someone in the intelligence community decided that one or more of the alien species had hostile designs on Earth, and that we had to use the technology that we gained from them to make Earth an unfriendly and unsafe place for visitors from other realms. And if you Google the United States Air Force Space Command, you will find out that we are rapidly achieving that goal. And with the extension of the anti-missile, the dual-purpose anti-missile missile system around the globe, Earth will become increasingly out of bounds to visitors. We have learned, however, that intelligence gathering is an imprecise science, and interpreting it depends to a large extent on the interpreter's worldview. Witness the rationale for the Iraq War. I recall, too, the wildly inaccurate estimates of the United States Air Force of the rate of Soviet ballistic missile production. And this misinformation led to some very dumb decisions in my country. So the reason I decided to go public was the very real fear that military intelligence inadvertently or deliberately misinterpreted the intention of the aliens. And I use the word deliberately in the sense of General Eisenhower's warning that the alien technology was falling into the wrong hands. A more likely scenario than wanting to attack us, which they could have done at any time in those early years. There was really nothing to stop them, with the possible exception of some high-powered radars. But otherwise, there was no means to destroy them, and they had, complete domination of our skies. But instead of trying to destroy us, they seemed genuinely concerned about our stewardship of our planet. Through deforestation, chemical contamination, overpopulation, global warming, and above all, increasing stockpiles of atomic weapons that in the hands of a madman, their use could result in making the planet uninhabitable for heaven only knows how long. But it's interesting that Corso subscribed to this enemy alien concept at the time he wrote The Day After Roswell, but later changed his mind. And he might have been influenced in part by speaking to one of the visitors face to face. He was aware of a landing that had taken place somewhere not far from where he was stationed, and he went over to investigate, went into an abandoned mine shaft, saw something that looked like a shadow, was wearing a helmet, pulled out his revolver, was about ready to shoot, when by mental telepathy he heard the word "don't." Then a minute or two later, he got another message by mental telepathy: "Will you shut down the radars for 10 minutes after the green time?" And in effect, give him a chance to escape. And Corso said to him, "What do you offer in return?" And the answer was, "A new world if you can take it." But let's say it was only 40%. or even 20%, if it is a commercially viable discovery. Every single plane, military and civil, built from tomorrow on should employ the technology, because just think of the fuel that it would save. Now, is it a reality? I don't know, but this is the problem when everything is secret and it's almost impossible to pry it out. Well, to what extent has research and development been limited to the military aspects of technology? Have there been breakthroughs in other areas? Did I get a signal down here? And especially energy, which is widely believed. Are we barking up the wrong tree when we start making plans for a 30-year supply of oil? A policy destined to change the planet irrevocably. These are the gargantuan issues that should be on the front burner of debate as a precursor to action plans for survival. We not only have to establish the true intentions of the aliens, and not through the filter of military intelligence. And if they are honorable, we should collaborate with them in the areas of medicine, agriculture, and energy, to name three, which some of them at least have indicated their willingness to do. Corso's book mentions Wilbert Smith, a Canadian who worked in the Federal Department of Transport, which is the one I became minister of after I left Defense. Smith was one of the early believers and wrote a top-secret memo to his boss based on information he had gained from Dr. Robert Sarbacher, who was intimately concerned with what was, or familiar with what was going on in the United States. And Smith not only obtained permission for Project Magnet, which was shared with the United States later, he also developed a network of contacts with the visitors from other places and came to the conclusion that they were well-intentioned. They answered his questions and gave him practical solutions, some of which he developed. They even explained why some of our aircraft crashed when they got too close to the spacecraft. The bottom line is that I have never seen a case where the aliens shot first. We warmongering and trigger-happy earthlings have always started the shooting. Shoot first and ask questions afterward. Sure, the visitors harassed our astronauts and ran surveillance checks on military installations, especially the ones with nuclear capability or storage. But this was all in the course of trying to tell us something. The message, which is as clear as the noses on our face, if we would just look into the mirror and see it, the message is that we can't save our planet by military means. We must have a massive shift in the allocation of resources away from the canopy of fear and into a new and innovative canopy of hope. We have to use the technology that the visitors have given us, and more that they are willing to share, to replace fossil fuels now in this decade, not 30 years from now, when it may indeed be too late. But this requires cooperation, not confrontation, both on Earth and in the cosmos. And any new wars of the future should be wars against poverty, hunger, illiteracy, ill health, and global warming. These are the wars that should engage the best scientific, entrepreneurial, and political minds available, freed from the limits of an earthly worldview. that we have to begin by insisting that we be told the truth, because, to paraphrase the Bible, only the truth will set us free. No longer is it sufficient to make the world our oyster. The star visitors have removed the canopy that restricted our view and understanding of the cosmos. And we don't want a handful of short-sighted Mr. Magoos to draw it back. The scientists of the cosmos, our cousins, are willing to share with you the best of ours, the biggest oyster of them all, the infinite cosmos. And thank God for that. And thank you for listening so intently.
That's great. Let's have some questions now.
Obviously, there's very little that we would agree on. I'm the one who investigated Corso, went through line by line. If you agree with Corso, every word is true. One of the things in there was that the Cold War was a cover for fighting E.T.
For fighting what?
Fighting E.T. That's in the book. Right?
Is it? Well, I'm not going to take every little nitpick literally.
That's hardly a nitpick.
But the purport of the book was confirmed not only by my friend, the retired Air Force general, but by the other most senior, most legitimate source that I know. And he too said Corso's book the day after Roswell was authentic.
That's why I name names. I'd like to have you name the names. I'd also like, you made a whole series of assertions that come out of conspiracy theory. Who, by name, is in contact with the ETs that's having, this dialogue where we can get the technology.
Well, Colonel, you know I'm not going to name names any more than you are.
Okay.
But, and because I would be doing them a great disservice. But you did say one thing, you said a couple of things that I agreed with. You said that the UFOs are not important to most of the people. And you're right. And this, I think, is the greatest challenge we have, because when you talk about this, people roll their eyes or raise their eyebrows and want to get back to earning a job and this sort of thing. But what they have to come to terms with, because a lot of those same people that are not the least bit interested in UFOs are extremely green-oriented and want to save the planet for future generations, for their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And they're going to extraordinary lengths, some of them, to do something about it. And they're going to have to somehow try to find out what has been accomplished. And I have been told, and I can't authenticate this, but I have been told that the Black Ops, as they're called, have mastered the art of zero-point energy and of cold fusion, both. And you shake your head. Well, it's hidden deeply somewhere, and maybe you can tell us where.
Okay, let's move on.
And only when we get the truth can we find out if it is possibly true that there are some of these rich people that you were talking about who would rather save their trillions from the oil business than to open up technologies that would cost them a fortune. I don't know if that's true or not, but I know some of the people involved enough to have very serious doubts about it.
Mr. Hellyer, one thing that this is based on Colonel Corso's book. We must remember that it was ghostwritten by Bill Burns. And what was told to me, and I knew Colonel Corso personally, was that he and Bill Burns, he did not read the final manuscript before it came out in 1997. because of the rush to get it out for the 50th anniversary of the Roswell crash, because, you know, commercially the book needed to get out. So I was also told that a little bit of disinformation gets mixed in with the information, and that is how this gets, we can pick on a few things like this. But are there other instances other than Corso's book that makes you believe this? You did go to the crash retrieval conference. Did you speak to other people?
Well, since I went public, I have received filing cabinets full of documents, dozens of books. I have talked to hundreds of people, and I have talked to some people whose testimony I believe implicitly. And I speak with that background. It is not from reading the National Enquirer, which I don't read, and it's not from reading the National Post in Toronto, which you know about. It is the best consensus distillation of available information that I have been able to discern. And it's taken a lot of work and a lot of time on my part. I agree with something that's been said here today, though, that is so big. And the final sentence I would like to say about it, because it applies to us all. I didn't know how much I didn't know, because I didn't know how much there was to know.